Hi, everyone. It's good to see you. Welcome. My name is Rabbi Alyssa Mendelson. I'm the Rabbi of Port Jewish Center, and we're thrilled to have you here today with us as we have the incredible opportunity to learn from the great Esther Safran Foer and to hear the amazing story that she has to tell us. But first, I just want to make sure that I welcome our friends who are here from places as far and wide, also not only from Port Jewish Center in Port Washington, New York, but from East Lansing, Michigan, and Berlin, Maryland, Binghamton, New York, Aspen, Colorado, Ormond Beach, Florida, and Poughkeepsie, New York. We've got quite a crew here, and some other friends from also from other places here and near and far too. So we're glad to all have you here as we have the opportunity to have a conversation, as I said, with our speaker, Esther Safran Foer, who is the author of I Want You to Know That We're Still Here, a Holocaust memoir. I want to tell you just a little bit about our speaker, Esther Safran Foer, I hope I'm saying it right, Esther, is the former executive director of Sixth and I Synagogue in Washington, D.C., but she's had really an incredible career. I said to Esther right before we started, I didn't have a bio for her. And she said, you can actually look me up on Wikipedia. And so I did. How cool that you have a bio on Wikipedia. So some things that you might find interesting. She worked as the press secretary for presidential candidate George McGovern. She founded a public relations firm. And she's also been recognized by the Forward as one of its Forward 50. The Washingtonian included her in their 2015 list of the most powerful women in Washington, D.C. And not only has she published her memoir just this last year during 2020, but perhaps what I love most about her is that she's the mom of 3 incredible sons. And I say that because I'm the mom of 3 incredible sons too. Of course, my children haven't, published award-winning novels yet, or which have been turned into movies, or been the head of major news periodicals in Washington, D.C. But nonetheless, a boy mom is a boy mom. So there you go. Anyway, without any further ado, I'd like to just turn things over to you, Esther, since I know people want to hear from you much more than they want to hear from me. So welcome, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you, and give those boys a chance. When my boys they get interviewed periodically, and people say, so, you all wrote books, you did this, that, what was growing up like? And they said, we ate junk food and we watched TV. We grew up in a very open household. So welcome. I'm delighted to be here with you and with another mother of 3 sons. And I'm delighted to talk about my book. I Want You to Know We're Still Here. It's my first book. It's probably my only book, but it was a story that I desperately wanted to tell. And I originally started it because it was something I wanted to preserve for my grandchildren. I have 6 wonderful grandchildren. They live wonderful, rather privileged lives. But I wanted them to know where they came from, what their family history was. They came from a family of shtetl Jews, from shtetls that I have visited, and I talk about that in the book, that still have dirt roads and still no indoor plumbing. And their family for generations lived in these places. Some were religious. Some of my grandparents and great-grandparents were religious. Some were not. Some were successful, and some suffered horrific tragedies. But this is where they came from. This is their family history. And before I start, I have to tell you that, well, I'll tell you a couple of things. In some ways, this is a book that comes from a book, which is somewhat unusual. The story evolved from a work of fiction. My middle son, my husband's in the other room, I should say our middle son, in his senior year, going as a rising senior at the university, was talking about what he would do his senior thesis on. And he was going to spend the summer in Europe, in Prague specifically. And I suggested that he might want to try visiting the Ukraine and seeing if he could find the family that we had heard had hid his grandfather, my father, for some part of the war. He did that. He went to the Ukraine for about 5 days. It was before cell phones. We had no idea where he was, what he was doing. There was no way that I could tell my mother that her precious grandson had gone back to this place that for her was full of tragedy. He found nothing. He was ill prepared. I didn't have the right information to give him. He came back and he did write a senior thesis, but he wrote a novel. And the novel was Everything is Illuminated. It was not only became an international bestseller, it also became a movie. And this story in some way evolves from that. Because of the novel and because it got was so well known, there were people who started to call me and write to me and say, what he wrote isn't true. And they were, in fact, even a little horrified that he would write these things about the precious shtetl that their families had come from. And so they started to tell me, and then they'd all say, but I know the real story. And they started to tell me those real stories. My first reaction to them was, guys, this is a novel. It's a work of fiction. But they didn't want to hear that. What they heard was that their precious ancestral homes were somehow, the memory of them were desecrated by this novel, which included sex and all sorts of things that a rising college senior might put into it. And from that, I started to put pieces of the story together. He went in 1998. I started to get information. Nothing about the journey I took, my own journey of discovery or putting this family history together, was methodical. It was really serendipitous. He went on this trip. People started to give me information. I traveled to places where I would reach out to people who came from these shtetls, and pieces started to fall in place. And then in 2009, I took the trip with my oldest son, Frank. And we found so much more than we ever expected to find. It was just the right time to do it. There were people who were still alive, who had been children, who witnessed what happened in these shtetls. I went to several different shtetls, and in every one of them, I found someone who knew something about my family. It was an incredible journey on several levels. The journey itself, the journey of doing it with one of my sons, and then the opportunity to write it. In some ways, that was as profound as the journey itself, to sit down and to come to terms with my family's history and to put it down in a way that I could pass it on to my grandchildren and their grandchildren. So that's kind of the backstory. Alyssa, do you want to start with a conversation, or should I read from the beginning of the book?
Can you read a little bit from the beginning of the book?
Good. So this is going to set the stage a bit. Page 1, chapter 1. My birth certificate says that I was born on September 8th, 1946 in Ziegenheim, Germany. It's the wrong date, the wrong city, the wrong country. It would take me years to understand why my father created this fabrication, why each year my mother came into my room on March 17th, gave me a kiss, and whispered happy birthday. Piercing together the fragments of my family's story has been a lifelong pursuit. I'm the offspring of Holocaust survivors, which by definition means there is a tragic and complicated history. My childhood was filled with silences that were punctuated by occasional shocking disclosures. I understood there was a lot that I didn't know, besides the secret of my invented birthday. My parents were reluctant to speak of the past, and I learned to maneuver around difficult subjects. When I was in my early 40s, preparing to give a talk at a local synagogue, I decided that this might be an opportunity to fill in a few of the gaps of our family story. I sat down with my mother in the pink kitchen of her 1950s suburban track house on a street where most of the other homes were occupied by families of Holocaust survivors. Sitting at her faux marble laminate kitchen table, I could see the carefully cut coupons stored in neat piles, ready for the next shopping trip. In the cabinet below, there was enough flour and cereal, all of it purchased on sale, to withstand a major catastrophe. She would have done really well during this COVID crisis. I started with a few questions about my father and his experience during the war. He had been an enigma, a mercurial figure that all conversation danced around, even in my own head. My mother took a sip of the instant coffee that she loved and casually mentioned that my father had been in a ghetto with his wife and daughter. He'd been on a work detail when they were both murdered by the Nazis. Absolutely stunned, I blurted out, "He had a wife and a daughter? Why haven't you told me this before? How can you be telling me this now for the first time?" I'd grown up surrounded by ghosts, sorry, I have a cold, haunted by relatives who were rarely talked about and by stories that no one would share. And now there was a new ghost that I hadn't even known about, my own half sister. I pressed my mother for more, but she made it clear that the conversation was over. Genug enough already. Of the person closest to me in the Holocaust, my half sibling, I had not one detail, not a name, not a picture, not one piece of memory. Here was a child, one among at least 1.5 million Jewish children who were murdered during the Holocaust, and there was no way to remember that this child had even lived. The search took me to places that allowed me to more deeply understand the Holocaust and how it continued to reverberate long past the liberation and into future generations. It was ultimately a search that took me to places inside myself. It's been said that Jews are an ahistorical people, concerned more with memory than history. A curious fact, there's no word in the Hebrew language that precisely connotes history. Zikaron, Zakor, used in its stead, translate to memory. The word for history in modern Hebrew is lifted from the English word, which was originally lifted from the Greek historia. History is public. Memory is personal. It's about stories and select experiences. History is about the end of something. Memory is about the beginning of something. And then I'm just going to read a quote from actually my son Jonathan from his novel, in which he says, "Jews have six senses: touch, taste, sight, smell, hearing, and memory. The Jew is pricked by a pin and remembers other pins. When a Jew encounters a pin, he asks, what does it remember like?" And why don't I stop there? And
So, so what do you think it was that was, I mean, I'm not sure if you answered this yet in your first remarks, but what do you think caused you to push Jonathan to go to the Ukraine and
Mhm.
and look for your story, and also what, and then the follow up really is, what was the tipping point for you when you realized, okay, I can't, all, it's not just that these people are sending me notes and it shook something up, but now I can't just sit here anymore. I have to move forward. And somebody just said, what's the name of the book? And I'll just say it again. It's called "I Want You to Know That We're Still Here."
And let
So
me add that in this past week, it was a National Jewish Book Award finalist. So
Mazel tov.
that's not yet in that bio. So one of my sons likes to say that leading up to my own trip and to I think I was scared to do it myself. I'm not sure what I was scared of, what I would find out. Maybe I'm not sure, but he likes to say that I was using child labor. So when my oldest son was graduating from high school, he had a research project to write. And, we sit around the table and anybody have any ideas? And I said, why don't you interview your grandmother? And I understood that there were things my mother wouldn't tell me. There was so many things that were painful when they were talked about between a mother and daughter. And I didn't ask questions because I didn't want to cause her any more pain. But she was willing to talk about it with her grandsons. It was a different conversation between mother and daughter. It was pain, but her grandsons were her immortality. And they saw her in a very different light. They saw her as a superhero, literally. She was somebody who had made it, who had survived, who had overcome all these terrible obstacles that other people hadn't. So it started with Frank, our oldest son. He spent like 6 weeks that he had taking her to every grocery store with every coupon that she had to buy the bargains, because none of the rest of us, she could, get us to go to one place, but she couldn't get us to go to all of them. And he did that. And he did it with a tape recorder between them in the car. And so it was a leisurely conversation. And that laid the groundwork. And those of you who want to do these conversations with your family, I don't think you can't get everything out in one sitting. You're going to learn things, and the interviewee is going to remember things that they're going to want to say in the next conversation. And the interviewer is going to hear things that trigger other questions. So Frank spent these 6 weeks taking his grandmother shopping and doing whatever she wanted during that period of time. And she was able to tell him her story. And it was from him that we had the framework of what happened. She was someone who left her shtetl as the paratroopers were coming down and the Nazis were invading. She never said goodbye to her mother, something that haunted her till her death. She picked herself up and ran along with several of her friends and went all the way, left this Polish shtetl, which is now in Western Ukraine, and went all the way across the Soviet Union into Asia. So we got the framework of the story then. And the next child that I used was Jonathan. And honestly, why wasn't I doing this myself? And I've asked myself that many times. I just somehow wasn't ready. I don't know if I didn't have the courage to confront some of the things that I thought I might find. But this worked pretty well. And they set the framework. And I say at the end of the book that the story is told. Each of my sons played a role in the telling of the story. Frank writing the original framework of my mother's story. Jonathan writing Everything is Illuminated, making the first trip to Ukraine. Frank then went with me to Ukraine. And my husband had said he would go with me if one of our sons wouldn't. But my husband rightfully said it's their story too. And if they'll go, I think that's the best option. And my oldest son, Frank, did go. And he is a journalist. He's written several books. And I remember saying to him, why did you decide to do this? Did you decide because you're a historian or because you're a journalist? And he said, no, I went as a son. And that was really powerful because we make these discoveries and then we'd have dinner every night. By the way, we had dinner at the same pizza restaurant every night because my mother kept saying, whatever you do, don't eat anything they give you. She was afraid of pork. She knew that everything was had some pork product in it. And so we found a pizza restaurant that we felt really safe in, and we went there every night, and we would talk and we would cry. And then our youngest son, Josh, finally brought the story home with the naming of his two children. Both of his children are named for uh, our Holocaust family. And so the names and the stories live on in these beautiful little children. So that's the role all of them played. It became a family adventure. And, I needed the time to be able to do it myself. I also I was raising three sons. I had a pretty great career. And I spent the last 10 years of my life working in the Jewish world, building an institution, a Jewish cultural center inside of a historic synagogue. And my focus was always on building the Jewish future. And I wasn't really, for a whole lot of probably deep psychological reasons, ready to look back. But in 2009, the time came. And then I started writing what I hoped would be something that was important to future generations. And someone knew I was writing it and said, how about if we turn it into a book? So here we are.
So your mom really is, you said your kids thought about your mom as a superhero, and the truth is your mom really was a superhero in the way that she lived her life and managed to survive multiple tragedies. Not just, her parents' tragic stories, but her own. And your father's suicide, and continuing her life, and finding another love, or I don't know if you would call how you would describe that relationship with her second husband. But so anyway, I just thought, could you talk a little bit more about your mom
Yes.
and her story?
Of course, we've created her now into a superhero, uh, but she really was for all of us. Whatever happened, she didn't bounce back. She bounced forward. She looked ahead. Okay, and I think that's probably characteristic of survivors. You've survived this. There's another calamity. And I'm going to survive this one too, because I survived the last one. And I think that's the part of the importance of storytelling, of putting your stories down and sharing them with your children and your grandchildren, your nieces, your nephews. Every family has its own tragedies. Not every family is a Holocaust family, but every family has had its ups and downs. And it's so important for children to understand that, to understand the ups and downs, but you can make it and you can come back. So yeah, my mother she was about 5 feet tall. She, at her height, she, she was the classic Bubby with an accent. She adored being a grandmother and a great grandmother, and was revered by her descendants. She would go to every grandparents' day, no matter where it was, and every college graduation. And she raised a family that's making an impact in this country. She came from a shtetl with dirt roads and no indoor plumbing. And she watched particularly her grandchildren, make their mark. One example of her, which really personifies what she was like. Our middle son, Jonathan, was invited on Martha Stewart. He'd been on the show to promote books. It was Passover, and Martha's producer said, why don't you come on and, we'll talk about Passover. And at that point, he had edited something called the New American Haggadah. And he called me and said, I don't know, I don't feel like doing it. What do you think? What do you think if I asked them if I could bring Bubby with me? And I said, well, I don't know. What do you think they would say? So he called the producer and he said, I'll come if I can bring my grandmother. Um, and they said, okay, we'll make matzo ball soup. We'll use her recipe for vegetarian matzo ball soup. At this point, a lot of the family is vegetarian. And so actually the first thing she said to me when I told her about it was, she says, will they pay for the trip? Uh, exactly. Um, and I assured her it was going to be okay. I went with her as the handler. She was on the show with Martha, and she asked me, she said, what shall I say? I said, personally, I would just answer their questions. I wouldn't, whatever she asks you, tell her. But that was not my mother. She gets on Martha Stewart in front of a live audience, this little tiny woman. And in fact, Jonathan was on first talking to Martha Stewart, and she was on the side waiting to come on, and she kept trying to push herself forward, and they had to say, no, not yet. And she went on there, and you could still see on YouTube, you can see the episode where she's standing there making the matzo balls, and she's going, excuse me, Martha. And then she said, I survived Hitler. And the audience broke out in applause. And so she knew she had a good line, so she went on telling her story. She was kind of fearless, not intimidated by much. Some of the things I found after she died in a box that she kept, actually it wasn't after she died, it was before she died when I forced her to tell me where her secret box was, that even as a widow, she was loaning money to people, and she kept the letters where they were thanking her and saying, please don't ever tell anybody. She kept the letters, the canceled checks, everything. She kept her ketubah from Poland, which is just incredible. She was married to my father in 1945 in Lodz, Poland. And there was the ketubah. And it was really interesting because first I looked at it and I thought, that was May the 5th. And I was talking to a friend of mine. I said, I found my mother's ketubah. This is amazing. And, it's in Hebrew. And I said, and she was married May the 5th. And my friend said, she wasn't. I said, how do you know? And he said, because May the 1st was Lag BaOmer that year. And Lag BaOmer was the one period of joy during a period of mourning where you could get married. And I am guessing that thousands and thousands of Jewish refugees chose to wait until that day to get married, that even after everything they'd seen and lived through, they were still going to keep that tradition. And in fact, my friend knew this because his father and mother had gotten married on that day. That's why he knew the May 1 was Lag BaOmer in 1945. I thought that was just beautiful. So yeah, she was tough. She was grateful for everything. She lived with us the last 3 years of her life. That's what she wanted. And if that's what she wanted, that's what we were going to do. And while that was difficult, there was also an incredible blessing to have her here, to have it become very natural for her grandchildren to come, for her great-grandchildren to go upstairs and see Bubby or bake cookies with her. It wasn't something I ever imagined myself doing, but I'm so grateful that I did.
I'm looking at the jars on the mantelpiece behind you. Are those the jars of the soil?
Jars, right. So when I went to Ukraine, I mean, what are you going to bring back with you besides pictures? And I took tons of pictures. I brought dirt from each of the mass graves. And when my mother died, the night before, I remembered the jar of dirt from her shtetl where her mother and her sisters are buried. And I poured some of that dirt into her grave. But yeah, it looks like an art installation. If people haven't read the book, they don't realize what it is. There are jars from the mass grave. There are leaves from the pear tree behind my father's house, where I imagine my half sister probably ate pears. And there are lots of happy jars of family vacations. Our youngest grandson, when he was 4, went to Israel for the first time, and he knows my jars. So he brought me back sand from his first visit to Israel from the Tel Aviv beach. So that's up there. It's the family story in jars.
So when I was reading the book, I was really taken with the number of people, like fascinating people, that you met along the way, and also like how you found your way to them. So I'm just thinking about, I love that you met with the forensic investigator, the guy from I think he was from the FBI or the CIA. And then, and I love the story of of the family in Brazil, that you didn't really want to visit, and
Right.
and so many of us have gone to places and our mothers have said to us, "Why don't you look up?" And you're like,
Right.
and how. So could you just talk a little bit about some of the interesting people that you met on your journey, and also if you want to talk a little bit about the different, I think it was Anna's, was it like you had all these, who were the Anna the teacher, Anna the guy, was it Anna, am I
Anna
remembering the
the
name?
teacher, Anna the translator, and Anna the old lady. All the key women I met in Ukraine were Annas, and the key men were Ivans. Go figure. Um, when we traveled, and we've been lucky enough to travel, I was in Brazil, where we have a large family, and where we really wanted to go, not to America, but to Brazil. But Brazil wouldn't let us in. And the fact of the matter is, America didn't want Jewish refugees either. No country in the world did. And that's the story of my fake birth certificate. We got in because my father faked my birth certificate so that we were able to get in under the quota. But in Brazil, we were going to Brazil. Actually, I went with one of my sons and his wife and my husband and a baby, their baby. My mother said, "Well, if you're going to Rio, look up Natan Kimmelblatt." He came from Trochenbrod, which was my father's family's village. And he was partners with my father in Lodz briefly after the war. And, I'm thinking, oh, this is another one of those people that my mother wants me to look up. But I can't say no to my mother. I mean, she was just that kind of woman. You just don't say no. So we were staying at a lovely hotel, the Copacabana Palace, kind of this glamorous hotel that somebody else was paying for, by the way. And there's a Natan jewelry store in the hotel, and I know that Natan is a jeweler. In fact, one of the largest jewelers in Brazil. He came from the same shtetl of dirt roads and built this jewelry empire. So I went into the store. I thought, okay, I can check this off my list and tell my mother I did it. So I walked into the store and I said to the clerk, I said, I want to leave a message for Natan. She said, well, he said headquarters. I said, well, I'll just write a note. She said, let me just call. And she called and he said, tell her to wait there. I'm going to send a car. And Natan sends his brother a limo with a driver to pick up my husband and I to go back to his headquarters, where he's got this jewelry empire, where he starts to tell me stories. His cousin married my father's sister, that he was partners with my father in this business in Lodz, Poland, which looked like sort of a deli, a cafe, but in fact, they were changing money in the back room, because in 1945 and 46, Jews were coming, everybody was, making their way across Europe, trying to figure out where they're going to land. And they were coming with currency from different locations. So while they were serving food and apparently, according to Natan, free drinks for any police officer or soldier, they were changing money in the back room. And Natan had all these amazing stories to tell me. And I was so grateful that, my mother was right. Once again, she was right. And I met Natan several times on future trips to Brazil. It turns out his brother had a photographic memory and told me exactly the location of the address of the store that they had with my father in Lodz, I was able to look it up, see it online. The face of it on Google Maps was exactly the same as what I had in a picture, with my father standing in front of it. And it was, go figure, it was where Arthur Rubinstein was born. But all this information would come together because I was willing to listen finally and put it together. And then it was after this trip that I put it together in writing.
One of the stories that, you know, the beautiful pictures that you paint are, was of actually driving, you know, being in the Jeep with Frank, driving through, you know, the forests and from the shtetls on the dirt roads, and being in the town. I think it was when you were in the town where your dad grew up, and I'm not sure I remember the name of the guy who was telling all the stories.
Yeah.
So it actually sounds like it's out of a movie, like almost out of like one of those dark comedies. But, you know, what was it like? Can you describe that for us a little bit and tell us, you know?
Dark comedy. We had, so why did we go at this particular time in 2009? You know, after I kept putting it off and not having the courage to take the trip, it turned out that a group of descendants from the shtetl of Trochenbrod, where my father's family came from, were planning a trip. Israelis, Americans, and some South Americans. So that became the hook for our trip. We thought, okay, now we have a date. You know, I can't put it off any longer. We'll go on that trip, and then we'll add several extra days to do our own research and investigation. Well, we were in Lutsk. Frank and I flew in through Lvov. The Israelis flew in through Kiev, or Kiev, I guess they say. We all now know a different pronunciation of that city based on the hearings, the Trump hearings, Kiev, I think. And I remember Frank and I got there first. And then all of a sudden we hear this commotion downstairs, and we come down to the lobby. And as Frank described it, it was like the IDF had come to save us. The Israeli Defense Forces had arrived. Everybody was talking at these incredibly high decibel levels. It was, you know, it was classic Jews talking above each other. And we all went on, I think it was it 2 or 3 buses to a village, and then got on these horse-drawn wagons to go to the shtetl, because there weren't any roads anymore. Nothing existed, nothing. And by the way, we get on these wagons. I don't know how many there were. There was a whole caravan of it. It was like a hayride. So here we were going into to mark and to say Kaddish at these mass graves where our ancestors had died. And we're going on a hayride to get there. Not only that, the Israelis had bought a huge Israeli flag with them. So in the middle of the Ukrainian forest, somebody suddenly unfurls this huge Israeli flag. It was like a dark comedy. And then the wagon that we're in, I don't know how they thought about it, but the driver had his daughter, and they had a Ukrainian flag. And Frank and I at that point were really horrified that we were in the wagon with the Ukrainian flag, not the Israeli flag. But here we are, you know, on this hayride. And there's this wonderful old man, Shmuel Potesh, whose father had a dairy, and he delivered the milk. And we're walking on a dirt road with no houses, no bricks, just this road. And he'd go, you know, Shmuel lived here and Moshe lived here, and he had an affair with so-and-so. And it was like he was a human GPS system. And then some of the survivors who had been to Trochenbrod started arguing about who lived where, as though it mattered. The biggest fight came at one of the mass graves, where one of the women said, you know, I want to say Kaddish here because my parents are buried here. And Shmuel said, no, they're not. They're at the other site. And this is what our adventure in the forests of Ukraine was like. It poured rain at one point. We had lunch together, and Frank and I weren't the only ones worried about what we were going to get for lunch. They started with bread, and one woman got up and she said, "Oh, this is so good. I could just live on the bread." Uh, it was like a comedy, and writing the book. I mean, it's about, it is about the Holocaust, and it is about these tragedies, but it's also about life and the humor in life. And in these shtetls, life was real. As I was doing my, I guess, interviews and getting information, I hear stories about abortions and divorces, and I'm like, really? And of course, it was life. Life was life there, and all the things that happen here happen there. Um, and I was glad to be able to preserve some of those stories.
I think there are people who want to ask questions as well. One person just sent me a note saying, "Are there any Jews still there?"
Absolutely not. Sadly, not Jews, but not a cemetery. What was the old Jewish cemetery had been built over, plowed under. There are Jews in Ukraine. Actually, there are a lot of Jewish oligarchs in Ukraine. But in these shtetls, no, even the shtetls you would have thought they would have missed, the Nazis didn't miss them. The other thing is that my family, like well over 1 million Jews, were not killed in concentration camps. They were killed in the Holocaust by bullets, one by one, bullet by bullet, by German soldiers, and sometimes with the help of collaborators.
Can you talk a little bit about the title of the book, and also, and also, one of the things that you did was you left pictures of your family.
Yeah,
So I feel like those two things are somehow connected. So could you
definitely.
talk a little bit about that?
Before we went, I spent time with people who had also made trips like this. And there were a lot of people who, a lot of people have done it. Most people find nothing. And I was trying to manage my expectations. I really didn't expect to find anything. Although in the end, I found so much more than I could have ever hoped for. And one friend of ours, who's a writer, said he went, and his dream was realized just walking the ground and breathing the air of his ancestors. But he said, I wanted to leave something behind. So I took my book. His particular book was called Kaddish, actually. And he said, and he left it on the ground. And his driver said, "Why would you do that? It's going to be blown away. It's going to be destroyed." And he said, "I just have to leave something of myself behind." And I thought that was an interesting idea. So what was I going to leave behind? And what I chose were our family's Shana Tova card. Every year at Rosh Hashanah, we take a picture. The last picture with my mother in it, that we sent out in 2019, had 14 people in it. Children, grandchildren, spouses. Sometimes there were even girlfriends that had to get photoshopped out if the relationship didn't go anywhere. But we wanted everybody in the picture. And I'm just really, it's very meaningful to me to take that picture and to watch my family grow. And I thought, that's what I'm taking with me. So I took a big stack of those Shana Tova cards. And when we visited each of the mass graves, Frank and I would take, after we'd say Kaddish and to have our moment of sadness and remembrance, we took a fork from the hotel and we buried those cards. Now, what does it mean that it was like my friend Leon. What did it mean that he left the book there? I was standing at the mass graves of my grandmothers, of my aunts, of my great-grandparents, who thought that their family, who I'm sure went to their deaths thinking that there would be no survivors, but there were. And as I placed those cards, it was like I was saying to them, we're still here. And that's ultimately, the title of the book means lots of different things, but that is the literal meaning of it. Being able to somehow convey that we're still here on lots of levels.
Yeah, it's I don't know whether you think about this. Also, I'm sure you have, but it's also powerful to me to think that for all those people who are in Ukraine now, it's like, yes, I'm still here. Like they couldn't do you. There
Right.
is a people, and we have a story, and I'm here to tell it and to pass it to a new generation.
And to the Nazis who thought they were going to get rid of all the Jews,
Yes.
we're still here.
Yes. I'm going to remove the spotlight so that we can kind of have a gallery view.
Okay.
And I want to open it up if there's anyone who has a question or a comment. I want to give people the opportunity. I have a few more questions, but I'm happy to open it up to somebody who's here who'd like to ask anything. So if you would, if you're interested, please feel free to raise your hand. Marcia and Mark, are you? Okay, Marcia, you're still muted. You're muted, Marcia.
I'm not now. So
okay, good.
I don't have a question. I just want to say I found your book mesmerizing, and I opened when I started on your travels, as it were. I opened Google Maps and I was following you, around Ukraine, because it just fascinated me that where was this town compared to that town, and I just think you were so courageous going out there. My father grew up in Chelm, as in Wise Men of Chelm. And, I've thought about going back there, and, it just seems like such a foreign place. So just you're picking up and getting an interpreter and traveling around and going to all those places. It's just fascinating.
It took me a long time to have the courage to do that. But if you're thinking about it, you should do it. You don't want to regret that you hadn't. It's really pretty powerful.
Someday.
Along those same lines, Hannah Berkowitz posted, I read the book and I've been wanting to visit my late father's shtetl and my late mother's town, both now in Western Ukraine. I've heard that local people often are afraid to speak, fearing the consequence. Why or how did you achieve their cooperation?
Well, first of all, I hired this young woman who kind of advanced the trip for us. She was young. She wasn't a professional. There are a number of professional genealogists of Jewish history that you can hire. I interviewed a number of them. I ended up with her because she'd worked for some friends of mine. She knew the area. So she went to these villages before I did. She was really committed to the idea of this trip and to helping us find something. So she went in advance and found older people who were there who might know stories. She had figured out who we were going to talk to. It wasn't hit or miss. The family, the descendants of the family that hid my father, she went there. She thought she had found them. She met with all of the different grandchildren. She followed up. She's what they call in the media business a fixer, somebody who will go ahead and see what the story is before you get there to make it easy for you to find it. So that helped a lot. It made a huge amount of difference. And there are a ton of these people. Now, there's a whole industry in Western Ukraine and in Poland.
So my next question, unless somebody else wants to interrupt me, is how did writing this book change you?
Oh, it changed me profoundly. It really, really did. First of all, as you'll see in the book, my father committed suicide when I was 8 years old. That while my mother was the ultimate survivor, my father couldn't. Now, whether that was because of he was a little older than my mother because he'd had a wife and child killed, I'll never really understand why. And that was something that we didn't talk about in my family. People just don't. He killed himself in the 50s. It was a time when you didn't talk about suicides and you didn't talk about psychological problems. In fact, when the survivors came here, people didn't quite know what to do with them. You know, there were American Jews who had already assimilated and were doing well. And now all of a sudden, these people are coming with accents and are going to kind of embarrass us. And there were social workers who dealt with the Holocaust survivors, but it was mostly to find you an apartment and find a job, not to deal with whatever your post-traumatic stress syndrome might have been. And I've forgotten your question already.
How did writing this book
How did
change?
it change me? You know, I was able to talk about things I hadn't talked about my entire life. And it's, I would imagine it's like going through therapy. The other interesting thing is that my mother died December 18th, 2018. And my book was due February 1st, 2019. Between the time that she died and the time I turned the book in, it was essentially ready because we knew she was dying, but I was able to go back and somehow add another layer of emotion into the book when she wasn't alive, when she wasn't looking over my shoulder telling me what I could say and not say. I came out of it. I did an interview with my son, Jonathan, I think at the Jewish Heritage Museum in New York. And he talks about the importance of talking in families. And he said, think about how much is lost when you are holding back. And the book allowed me to let go.
Somebody put a comment in, Esther, thank you for sharing this very personal journey. I'm sorry. My grandparents are also from the Ukraine, so I look forward to learning more about the impact of your personal journey. And I think, that comment really is, how do you think, how are you hoping that, by telling this story, how are you hoping that it will, what do you hope the lasting impact will be for the reader and also for your family? For your children and maybe more importantly, for your grandchildren?
Sure. The morning my book was released was right at the beginning of COVID, March 2020. I remember writing to my publisher and saying, oh, gee, couldn't you just put it off a little? And they're like, it doesn't work that way. The book is coming out, it's printed, and my grandchildren that morning, bless their hearts, they're my oldest grandson. He's not my oldest grandchild, but he's going to be Steven's. Got a Steven Spielberg kind of inclination. Put together a video. He got his brother and his cousins to tell me how proud they were and how much this means to them. That they knew they figured I would be disappointed coming out in the middle of COVID, but how much this means to them. And I know the older grandchildren have read it. My 8-year-old grandson, who I'm sure has not read it, said, we have show and tell tomorrow and I'm going to bring your book with me. So I long after most of the books on our bookshelves are gone, I know that they will be reading this. To me, it was so important that they understand their story. I mean, we as a people, what do we read family stories. The Famash, is family stories, sometimes dysfunctional family stories, and the lessons that you learn from those families. And now they also have their own family stories. For other people, I urge you to write your story, to try to come to terms with issues that you may have about your family, to write them. It's not necessarily a book. I would never force somebody to write a book. It's a hard thing to do, but it can be a couple of pages. But it is so important to put these stories down. These stories, as I said earlier, the whole concept of history and memory. History is about talking about what happened between 1940 and 1946. Memory is what happened to my family, something that I will carry forward with me that is personal. So I urge you to take the time to try to do that. It'll be so meaningful. And I'm convinced we'll build resilience in future generations.
I think that it's really it's almost appropriate that that your book came out during COVID, because it is such a personal story. It is, you know, it is so much about your family, and through these kinds of talks, you know, we get to kind of we're invited into your family room and you're invited into ours. You know, we kind of get to sit with each other in each other's homes and share, you know, and share part of your story and be inspired, hopefully, to figure out how we can share our own. And I just want to thank you so much for your time and for the gift of, you know, the incredible job, the incredible journey that you took us on. And by the way, also, if you haven't yet read the book, you know, if you're feeling a little bit, you know, stuck at home, read this book and it will take you on a journey around the world, to countries far and wide. And it's really an incredible, it's a incredible opportunity to travel throughout time and space. So Esther, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Friends, as again, the book is called I Want You to Know That We're Still Here. Thank you very much for coming. And Esther, we are profoundly grateful to you. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.